Well, we've been talking about the Second Great Awakening. Let's go back in now. We sort of did a flyover. Let's go back in and look at some details. I actually have for you here an account of some of the things that happened at Cane Ridge. Now, this was recorded by Peter Cartwright. He went on to be probably one of the most popular Methodist preachers in the early 1800s. He was actually converted at Cane Ridge as a teenager in 1801, and at the end of his life, he wrote his diary and reflects back on that time at Cane Ridge. So let's hear about it firsthand. He says, from 1800, for years, a blessed revival of religion spread through almost the entire inhabited parts of the West: Kentucky, Tennessee, the Carolinas, and many other parts. They would erect their camps with logs or frame them and cover them with clapboards or shingles. They would also erect a shed sufficiently large to protect 5,000 people from the elements and from the wind and from the rain. And they'd cover it with boards or shingles. They'd build a large stand. They would seat the shed, meaning they would put seats in there for everyone. And here they would collect together from 40 to 50 miles around, sometimes further than that, 10, 20, and sometimes 30 ministers of different denominations would come together and preach night and day, 4 or 5 days together, right? So they build this massive tabernacle in the middle of a field somewhere. They gather 10, 20, 30 preachers, and they just preach around the clock. And people come in wagons, and they come and go, and they come from all these different regions. Now at Cane Ridge, tens of thousands of people descended upon Cane Ridge. And again, this is far exceeding the population of that county, so they were coming from everywhere. He goes on to talk about how many happy thousands were awakened and converted to God at these camp meetings. Some sinners mocked. Some of the old, dry professors, well, they opposed. Remember, this is like the First Great Awakening. We have the detractors. And then I love this. Some of the old, starched Presbyterian preachers preached against it, right? But still, the work went on and spread almost in every direction, etc., etc. He goes on to talk about how the Methodists were in this, and for the most part, kept moderately balanced, for we had excellent preachers to steer the ship and to guide the flock. But some of our members, meaning Methodists, ran wild and indulged in some extravagancies that were hard to control. The Presbyterian preachers and members, not being accustomed to much noise or shouting, when they yielded to it, went into great extremes and downright wildness. So here we have Presbyterians going wild on the frontier at Cane Ridge. Now, Peter Cartwright goes on to describe what he calls people getting the jerks. Now, by the jerks, these are uncontrollable convulsions that would just come on them. He says a new exercise broke out among us called the jerks, which was overwhelming in its effects upon the bodies and minds of the people. And it would just come on. He said it would be taken under a warm song or a sermon, and they were seized with a convulsive jerking all over. He goes on to say that some people would even try to run away to hide from it, but running away only made it worse, right? So this was happening at Cane Ridge in 1801. And I think one of the things that we are seeing here is a very key description of the Second Great Awakening. It's a word that was sometimes used of the revivals of the Wesleys back in Old England, back during the First Great Awakening, of enthusiasm. Now, when we say enthusiasm, we tend to mean, how we get at a sports event when our team is winning. That's enthusiasm. That's not what this means. The key here is the asm part, or the ism part. The key here is that enthusiasm is the idea that a genuine religious conversion is the outward expression, a dramatic outward expression. Now, you've seen this, right? All you have to do is turn on your television late at night and watch the faith healers. That's enthusiasm. It's not just a passion for the things of God. It's not an excitement for the things of God. It is saying that this is conversion, that it results in this almost uncontrollable physical expression. Now, we're going to see how this will materialize in the 1900s with the Pentecostal movement. But what we have here is a bit of a foreshadowing of what is to come. Now, as we move to Finney, and as we move to what Finney was up to in the revivals, we add another idea, and that is the idea of what we call the new measures, or this word, innovation. Now, I already mentioned to you that Finney, while he was under review of the presbytery, when asked about the Westminster Standards, replies, never read them. Finney was not controlled by some kind of a system. He, in fact, abhorred systems, especially theological systems. And instead, he was, I'm going to give you this term, and I want to spend some time describing both, because I think both the new measures and Biblicism are very key to understanding this transition and seeing, going back to our notion of a tale of two paths or a tale of two cities, we could really speak of a tale of two awakenings. What was happening in the first Great Awakening and what was happening in the second Great Awakening, and we can contrast them. So first, the new measures. Let me give you this quote from Charles Finney. Charles Finney, in his book on revivals that was published in 1835, said, "Revival is a purely philosophical result of the right use of the constituted means." Now, what he's going to go on to say is that when there is a revival, you can pray it down, right? In other words, you acknowledge that the revival is the work of God. An awakening is the work of God. All you should do is pray that God would be at work. You can either pray it down or you can work it up. You can cultivate the soil. You can create an atmosphere. You can create the conditions that are conducive to a revival. And Finney sets out to say, I'm going to do both. But his innovation, his new measures, is this idea that a revival is something that comes about by the right use of means, the new measures. Now, as we understand Scripture, as we understand what happened in the First Great Awakening, as we understand awakenings throughout church history, we see revival as the result of the Spirit of God at work. The word preached, which will not return void, and the Spirit of God at work, that is what brings about revival. Finney introduces a new approach. One of those new measures that Finney introduces was called the anxious bench. Now, the Puritans would speak of a person who was soul anxious. So let's say you are at Enfield, Connecticut, and you heard Edwards preach his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and you were convicted. When that sermon was over, the eyewitnesses tell us this is what they did. They sang a hymn, and they were dismissed, and they went home. What you do then is the next day, you write a little note, and you send it to the pastor, or you send it to an elder, and you ask for a pastoral call because you are soul anxious. That was the terminology. Something in that sermon convicted you, and now you're anxious about the state of your soul, and you call for a pastoral call to counsel you. And you may be converted, you may just be pastorally counseled, but that's how they did it. That's too much bureaucracy for Finney. That's too much mediation and delay. If you're soul anxious, let's do something about it right now. And so he had a bench down front, and it was called the anxious bench for those who were soul anxious to come forward. And he begins introducing a sort of act that then is a catalyst for your conversion. And it is the act of coming forward. And Finney will tell you in your sermon, you may think you're a Christian, you're not a Christian. You need to make it right now. Well, you're sitting in the audience, you're apoplectic from doubt about your salvation. What are you going to do, right? You're going to come forward. And so people were coming forward. Finney would also talk about use of music to set the tone and the mood. So you start off the service with exuberant music. You want people happy. You want them on their feet. You want to make a noise. You want the people who are outside, who are walking across the street to go to the saloon, to stop just before they get to the saloon doors, turn around and come into the revival meeting, right? So the music at the beginning is loud, but just before the pastor goes up, what do? Let's slow the tempo down, right? And then at the end of the sermon, let's bring the instruments in, just softly, under the pastor's words, right? What are we doing here? We are creating a mood. We are creating conditions. This is all part of Finney's new measures. Of course, the Princetonians, and we'll talk about them in our next episode together. Do you notice how I do this? I keep giving you little incentives to come back. So if you want to hear about the Princetonians, you got to tune in next week. But the Princetonians, Warfield, looking at all of this, I think offered what was the most stinging critique of Finney, and it was simply this. Everything that happened around Finney and that Finney did could have been done without any reference to or recourse to God. And it was a way of saying this idea that revival is simply the right use of means, is a way of precluding God. And remember, we talked about this with the Puritans. They were Calvinistic, which means they were monergistic. This is at best cooperation. But it is you doing something about your soul. Finney flat outright rejected the doctrine of original sin. We are capable of putting ourselves in the position where God will save us. We are capable of, as it were, getting God's attention to save us. You know, one of my favorite lines, I think it's one of the most beautiful lines in all of theological literature. It goes back to one of Luther's theses, not of the Wittenberg door, but at the Heidelberg Disputation. And in there, Luther writes, "The love of God does not find that which is lovely, but creates it." Now, we all know why that is true, because there's nothing lovely about us. And as much as I love you people and enjoy spending this time with you, let's all be honest, we're not all that lovely, right? We are sinners at the root. We are enemies of God. What did Dr. Sproul teach us? Sin is cosmic treason. We are cosmic rebels, traitors. We're not lovely. But that's okay, because the love of God isn't looking for that which is lovely. He creates that which is lovely. See, that's a true understanding of God's grace, because it's a true understanding of the human condition. And Finney doesn't have that. He doesn't have an understanding of the human condition. He undersells grace, and now he's going to undersell what Christ is doing on the cross. This is the fundamental problem with the Second Great Awakening. It is a negotiating of the gospel. It is a weakening of the gospel. So, what do we have coming out of the Second Great Awakening? Oh, well, let's talk about Biblicism, since it's there too. Because this is one of Finney's defenses against the new measures, this idea of Biblicism. And just to sort of tack on here a little bit more historical data, just to sort of set the context here, we could look at one of the things that grew out of the Cane Ridge movement. One of the figures at Cane Ridge was Barton Stone. Barton Stone was a Presbyterian minister. He would join up with Alexander Campbell, and Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell would form what was called the Stone-Campbell movement. It formed the Church of Christ, or the Christian Church, or sometimes called the Disciples of Christ Church. It did not exist at 1800. By 1840, it's the fifth largest denomination in the United States, the Disciples of Christ. It spread like wildfire. When Barton Stone, as a Presbyterian minister, decided to leave Presbyterianism, he took a copy of the Westminster Standards and his ordination certificate, put it in a tin box, dug a hole, and buried it, and preached a sermon called The Last Will and Testament, leaving behind confessionalism for the Bible only. And as he's reading the Bible only, you know what he discovers? The Bible doesn't have the word Trinity in it. So now he leaves behind Trinitarian doctrine. Not just the word, but doctrine. And then he finds that this discussion of who Jesus is and the hypostatic union, that's not a biblical word either. So he begins leaving behind, additionally, the deity of Christ. Now, Alexander Campbell opposes him on these things, and there are some disagreements between them. But I think he illustrates this point. Now we can get into trying to understand this concept of Biblicism. Biblicism seems like a good thing. Anything that promotes the Bible and is about the Bible is a good thing. But that's not Biblicism. Biblicism is the idea of, no creed but the Bible. I don't know if you've ever heard that, or, all I need is the Bible only. Well, here's what happens when we tend to do that. First of all, the Bible is a big book. And on the one hand, the Bible is also a complex book. You can't just pull out a few instances from the Gospels and say, well, that's who Jesus is. You have to look at what? The whole counsel of God. You have to look at the Bible's whole teaching of who Jesus is. And then you say, now this is Orthodox Christology. And that's all the Chalcedonian Creed does. It doesn't invent anything about Jesus, doesn't add anything about Jesus. It synthesizes all of the teaching of Jesus into a concise, comprehensive statement of who Jesus is. That's what the Trinity is. It's not adding anything to the Bible's teaching of who God is. It's simply synthesizing all of the teaching of the Bible of who God is. Confessions and creeds are not counter to the Bible. They help us take the whole counsel of God into consideration. What happens with Biblicism is we actually tend not to take the whole counsel of God, but we sort of camp out at those pet passages and those texts that we have an affinity with, and we gravitate towards them and we stay there. And we don't always pay attention to the whole counsel of God. And that fundamentally is the problem with Biblicism. That fundamentally was the problem with Finney. Somewhere along the way, he stopped reading John 6. And he should have, because he would realize that synergism is not a biblical concept, as Jesus himself declares it. That no one's going to come to me unless the Father brings them to me. And so Biblicism on the surface seems like it's a step forward, but the way it gets worked out in practice is many times steps back. Now, let's see this, and let's return to our notion of a tale of two paths, but let's think in terms of a tale of two awakenings. So we've got, on the one hand, we've got the First Great Awakening, and we've got the Second Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening was confessional, and it was Calvinistic. As we move into the Second Great Awakening, it was not confessional and not Calvinistic. So rather than stressing the work of God, it's going to stress the work of man. And it's going to stress our response to God. And it's going to put the burden on us. You know, we can go back to Edward's sermon, God glorified in man's dependence, that it is only in this notion, or in this vein rather, of seeing salvation as the work of God, that in the end gives and reserves the glory for where it should be, the glory for God. But in this approach, the glory comes to us, right? We are part of the equation. So as you begin to compare and contrast the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening, you're going to see some of those emphases that flow out of this into contemporary American Christianity that sadly, in many ways, have eclipsed the emphases coming out of the First Great Awakening, of the Calvinism and the confessionalism and the boundaries that that brought to the church. There's one more piece to this, and it's very interesting. If we go to this great historian of American Christianity, Nathan Hatch, published this book called The Democratization of American Christianity. And one of the things that Hatch talks about is that this idea of the Second Great Awakening had a tendency towards religious populism. In other words, the First Great Awakening was still within the structures of a hierarchy. These were trained clergy, there were structures at work. But when you come into the Second Great Awakening, a lot of these folks were not trained. They were outside the bounds of a denomination or outside the bounds of an authority or a church authority over them. And so Hatch draws this conclusion, and I want you to think about this. An equally distinctive feature of the religious scene in modern America is the presence of a remarkable set of popular leaders, persons who derive their authority not from their education or stature within modern denominations, but from the democratic art of persuasion. These gospel ministers, remarkably attuned to popular opinion, continue to rise from obscurity, to command significant audiences, and to organize movements and churches around them. This was Barton Stone, this was Alexander Campbell, this was Charles Finney. Nathan Hatch goes on to say, modern populist religious readers include Catherine Kuhlman, Oral Roberts, Robert Schuller, Jimmy Swaggart, and Pat Robertson, to name a few. We could probably think of people like Joel Osteen, for instance, that would fit this bill. But as we think of the Second Great Awakening, it's not just simply a deviation or a drift from theological commitments that marked earlier generations of Orthodox American Christianity. It's also new structures that were put into place, new approaches. This dramatic emphasis of Whitefield provided a platform for those who may not have had the biblical or theological training, but they'd mastered the art of persuasion. And I think as we understand the continuing unfolding of the story of American Christianity, we will continue to see the impact that the Second Great Awakening has had. Well, as the Second Great Awakening is coming to a close, America is about to head to civil war. So we will pick it up there at our next episode.